All right, so now let's create our repository. So let's go to repository and create a new class, just a normal class. Let's say book repository. And this repository, we're going to inject our DAO or our book API, right? Makes sense because we need that so we can access the data. So I'm going to say at inject, like this, constructor, and I'm going to inject our private val API, which is going to be our books API. Okay, right. So inside here, I'm going to create a suspend function. Again, I'm going to say get books. So get books, of course, you're going to call the get books or get all books from our books API. So this is the public interface per se of our books API. So I'm going to pass in the search query term, and it's going to be just a string, and it's going to expect to receive a list containing items. Okay. Now, why is it a list containing item? Now, this item here, let's go ahead and import. It's going to be our item model there. Now, why is that? Let me just finalize this. Well, we need this because remember, when everything comes in, this is the list actually that will contain the volume info, which contains the information about the book or the books in this case. So it's going to have a list of all these items, meaning we're going to get a list of all of this, which is what we want. So when we return whatever we're getting, in this case, just going to be a list of items, as we said, this would work okay. But we need to be a little bit more clever because the idea really, especially when we're getting information from somewhere, database or a server API and so forth, we want to be able to wrap it around a different wrapper class, which will allow us to add more information about that data. Which means, let's say we want to check to see if, as we get this information, these books, to see if the loading status is loading or not loading, or done loading, or if it's the loading status is idle or running and so forth, right? Or maybe if there are exceptions, something happened and we want to know that. There's no way for us to get to add or attach that information in a list as such. Okay? So we're going to use a wrapper class that we're going to create, which will allow us to not only wrap this information, which is important, but we can wrap other things such as, okay, if it's loading, right, a boolean and an exception and any other thing we want when we get this information from the API. So what I'm going to do is, instead of a data here, I'm going to create yet another class. It's going to be just a class, and it's going to be a data class actually. Let's call this data or exception as such. So the types that I'm going to pass in our data or exception are going to be T, in this case T for template. So this is generics. So this can be anything we want. Could be a list of items, which is what we're going to be using. Could be just strings, could be whatever we want. And then we're going to pass a boolean because we want to check or to keep track of whether we're loading or not. Right? And then I'm going to pass an exception, E as such, and it's going to be just an exception, a general exception like this. And then in our constructor here, I'm going to say var, it's going to be data. So data is going to be the T type that we're passing along, and could be null. And it could also be null. And then I'm going to create the boolean. So this is going to be loading, could name whatever we want. It's going to be a boolean type. And I'm going to also say this is null. And var E, that's going to be exception, and that could also be null. All right, there we go. So this will allow us to then say, for instance, data or exception. When we get information, we're going to attach to our data variable, which is going to be any type. It could be a string, a list, or whatever we want. And then we can say, oh, by the way, as we wrap this information, this data, a list of books in this case, we also want to attach loading status. Oh, it's loading. It's true. Great. Oh, we're also going to attach an exception if that happens. Okay. So now, instead of doing this way, I'm going to say something like data or exception, and wrap all of this inside as such. And then, of course, I'll have to instantiate it. Actually, before we do that, let's just continue here, because we pass, for the first, is going to be in a list of items. And then next, we're going to pass what? Well, I can pass a boolean here, just say boolean. And then for the exception, let's put this in a new line, maybe it's going to be better. And then for the exception, I'm just going to say exception like this. It looks like overkill, too much going on, but this is the way you should always do, because like I said, we can attach more information, not just the list. At the top, I'm going to create another private val called data or exception type here, and set that to data or exception just to initialize it. And we're going to pass a list of items, our items by the way. And then I'm going to pass a boolean, and then I'll have an exception type like this. I can then at some point say data or exception dot, look at this, I can attach into our data type a list, expecting a list of items. I can also say data dot e for exception, because the data dot loading, and say is equal to true, something like that, if it's loading. All right, so this gives us that flexibility. All right, so this is exactly what we're going to do. Inside, I'm going to say, inside our get books, let's say try and catch exception. All right, so we're going to try first. So here I'm going to say data or exception, because we are starting everything. I'm going to say loading. I'm going to say to true, to say yes, it is loading. And then I'm going to say data or exception that data, I'm going to say is equal to, set that to our API, which is going to be our books API dot get all books, and pass the query. In this case, it's going to be the search query like this. But for that, then I have to say dot get items, which is the list items that we need. And what I can also do here, I can say if our data or exception dot let's say data, data or exception, let's get the actual data or exception, right? Dot data, if that is empty, or actually is not empty, right? Perhaps we need to do like this, right? If not empty, then I can say data or exception dot loading, set that to false. What this does is that if we're checking in our front end, in our composable, if we are still loading, if it's false, then we can stop, for instance, this circle indicator, right? And so for our exception here, I'm just going to actually say data dot, for our exception, I'm going to pass, well, this exception that we're getting. And then at the bottom here, we're going to return, not our list, we're going to return our data or exception as a whole object, because we then are going to be able to say check, not just for the actual list, we can check for loading or the exception, if there is indeed an exception. And while we're here, I can create another suspend function, which is going to be for when we want to get book information. So I'm going to suspend get book info, such. I'm going to have to pass book ID, a string, and here I'm going to do the same thing, data or exception. I'm going to pass, we want an item book, okay, like this, and voila. Looks like this is not looking good. Oh, right, because I need to pass other things as well. So pass a boolean and pass an exception. So we can say data or exception in this case, and say dot loading is equal to true. And then I'm just going to say API dot get info books and pass our book ID as such. And in this case, to separate things here, I can create yet another data or exception just for this other guy there at the bottom. Doesn't matter, but let's see. Say book info data. Book info data or exception. I think this is better, and this will expect, of course, just an item, not a list, like this, so we can use that. So with that, then we can specialize everything into one. So now I can just use that for loading, and then I can say our book that info that data. It's gonna set to that because it's expecting just a list. Okay, and then here I can then say, even if I want, I can say if book info that data is, let's say, dot to string and is not empty. That's the case. I'm going to say data or book info that exception loading, set that to false because we're done. And then else, and when it's exception, I'm going to say book info data, pass the E, and just pass our E that we're getting from our exception there. All right, so we have this set up. It should be ready for us to use whenever we are ready to use our repository. But really consider using this clean architecture as such, because then, as you see, it allows you to add more metadata to our payload that we're getting from our response.